Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second installment of the CX Energy Virtual Experience, presented by the AABC Commissioning Group, as well as its sister organizations, Associated Air Balance Council and the Energy Management Association. I'm Sam Schwartz, and I'm a Member Engagement and Marketing Manager for ACG, AABC, and EMA. We are, of course, disappointed that CX Energy couldn't be held in person this year. Our goal now is to bring you as much of the commissioning, energy management, and testing-related education as we can through a combination of these live webinars, as well as some additional pre-recorded sessions. Finally, in terms of continuing education credit, you will receive an email after the webinar with instructions on how to get your proof of attendance. We're going to be asking you to check into the sessions on the CX Energy app to automate that process. Today's presentation, Balancing Act, Strategies and Lessons Learned from Companies that do both TAB and commissioning, is sponsored by the Associated Air Balance Council, the world's leading association of independent test and balance agencies. Please welcome our speaker, Justin Garner of Engineered Air Balance in Houston, Texas. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And with that, Justin, I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thank you, Sam. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and hopefully that this presentation is worthwhile of your time and that you get some valuable information out of it. Again, as Sam indicated, my name is Justin Garner. I work for Engineered Air Balance Company in Houston, Texas. We provide testing and balancing and building commissioning services. So that's a little bit of my background. Let's start advancing here. This is an AIA continuing education course. So credits will be issued, as Sam alluded to earlier. All materials within this presentation are copyrighted, but you can obtain a copy of it, as Sam talked about earlier. The course description is listed here. A little bit more than what was stated earlier. Providing both TAB and commissioning services within a single firm can pose challenges that we're going to discuss today. But there are ways that we can provide a bigger or better value to the owner and our clients in delivering those services, and that's what we're going to try to get across with today's presentation. Some of the learning objectives today, we're going to learn to evaluate deliverables of both the TAB and commissioning processes that would overlap in scope between TAB and commissioning providers. Learn to develop a process to differentiate the services in order to meet the client's objectives, especially if it's within the same firm providing those services. Learn the correct roles of the TAB and commissioning teams during the various phases, including early construction, equipment startup, testing and acceptance, and closeout warranty phases of a project. And then learn how the two teams of TAB and commissioning can cooperate and help one another to efficiently complete their respective scopes, thus providing a higher quality process for the owner, which is, I think, the ultimate goal of all TAB and commissioning providers. So I challenge everyone here, and unfortunately, in a live setting, I would like to poll everybody and see what kind of audience we have, but we don't have that capability here. But I would assume that we have a mix in the audience of both TAB providers, design professionals, maybe owners, maybe building operators, and also probably a number of commissioning providers. So I'm going to try and speak to each perspective, but understand that this is really about TAB and commissioning in services, and whether they're provided by two separate entities or whether they're provided by a common entity, such as one particular firm. And so I'll really challenge everyone that if you were to, if there were to be a TAB firm that provided TAB as AABC calls out in the National Standards for Total System Balancing, we're going to discuss that a little bit more in detail as we move on. Could that firm, and would that firm, also be able to provide valuable building commissioning services? And I argue that yes, they can. And there are many firms in both AABC, that are members of ACG as well, that provide those services. So that begs the question, what is the best value for the owner Is it two separate providers, or is there value in one firm providing both those services? And we're going to try to address that as we move forward in talking about how a single firm can provide both of those services. One of the biggest questions that we receive, and as we at my firm were starting to provide building commissioning in addition to our core services at that time of test and balance of HVAC equipment, was what is the perception from the project team? Because there's an overall perception that, well, isn't that the fox guarding the hen house? Isn't the commissioning provider supposed to oversee the test and balance activities as well, and try to provide some quality assurance or accuracy with respect to how those activities are performed? And that's certainly a valid concern, and we're going to try to address that question also. But what I want to challenge everybody to remember is, what is the end goal? And the end goal here is the owner satisfaction. And irregardless of the contractual lines, because sometimes these services are contractually procured in various fashions through the contractor or through other means. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, we're working to provide the owner or the client, whoever's taking over this facility, with a high quality process and a facility that meets their needs. So that's the ultimate end goal, and I want everybody to keep that in the back of their mind. So I'm going to start out by addressing, if you have a tab firm and you're going to try to provide both services, how do you reasonably go about doing that? And there's a few different approaches to this. And we spent a lot of time in my firm going through this when we first started trying to provide building commissioning services as a separate function. And we really spent a lot of time internally deciding, how do we best do this in the interest of our clients? And what we came up with was the fact that we needed dedicated personnel. Now, we recognize that is not feasible in many firms, but it's definitely, I believe, the preferred way, because it keeps these roles clearly defined, almost like you have two different companies, but you can have two different groups of people in the same company that work together, but also hold each other accountable. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along through the various processes and deliverables in the commissioning process. But it's important that those roles are clearly defined. It gets a little bit muddy when you have personnel that are performing both test and balance and commissioning roles. And it's not to say that can't be done. We're going to discuss that as kind of a hybrid approach. But everyone on the project team needs to understand that, so that there are not any misconceptions. The second item here on this slide is tab personnel that understand the commissioning process and may also hold commissioning certification. Understandably, that's how many tab firms get started in providing building commissioning services. It may be a scenario where they have a trusted client who trusts them to provide tab services and wants to also bring on board commissioning as well. And so they ask their tab firm, hey, can you guys also do that? It may be a situation where those services are needed, or the tab firm has a lot of history with the facility or a particular application and can provide those services. But what we found is you still need to have separate personnel on a project if at all possible. And this may be, if you have multiple teams in your firm, you take a tab person from another team and have them perform the commissioning roles. Even though technically on any other project, they would be a tab person and not a member of your commissioning team. And you have other technicians that would normally be performing the tab scope. And in that way, from a project team perspective, they know to go to the tab person for tab issues or tab coordination, and to go to the commissioning person on your team for commissioning guidance and for leadership with respect to the commissioning process and so forth. And we just found, irregardless of how you do it, and if you can't have completely separate personnel, you still have to separate those roles on a project and then clearly define those roles up front, in front of the entire project team, and the project team being the owner's personnel, the design team, the contracting or the contractors team, and so forth. What you don't want to have happen here is a member of the contractors team come up and speak to one of the tab personnel about a commissioning issue or vice versa. And so that's why it's very, very important to have clarity in those roles. So with that being said, the next process is to kind of decide how are these services going to be provided. And there's 4 different scenarios. These are very simple, but each one is addressed separately. So if you have a tab firm that can provide both building, commissioning, and testing and balancing services, they could be contracted in one of 4 ways. They could provide testing and balancing services only. They can provide building commissioning services only. They can provide test and balance services as separate services by the same firm, meaning you would almost provide 2 different scopes of work, maybe even 2 different proposals, may even be to 2 different entities. And in many cases, in our own firm, we've been asked to provide commissioning services directly to the owner in the traditional sense. And we've provided testing and balancing services to the general contractor or to the mechanical contractor, but we had the same company providing those services on the project, but just to different entities. And then the 4th item here is providing those as combined services by the same firm. And when you can propose those services, especially to the same entity, combined during that proposal process, we feel you can bring the best value to the owner if they're willing to have that arrangement, because you can truly coordinate some of the roles and responsibilities that we're going to discuss further in this presentation, and make sure that you don't have any overlap, or the overlap is minimized, and thereby that that they're using their dollars as best they can. So I want to cover a couple of those scenarios here and some of the overlap that could take place. I apologize in advance because I would have liked to put some animation into the slide to reveal some of these things, but given this platform, we can't do that. So with respect to some of these responsibilities, the tab firm, and we're referencing AABC national standards for total system balancing here. So just bear with me because we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But the tab firm would be responsible for performing a balanceability review. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Pre-balance observations, proportioning air and water distribution, and measuring equipment performance. And equipment performance is thermal performance, and many other things there. That's a very simplified statement. Control point and sensor calibration verification, overall control verification, meaning sequence verification, and then some more supporting the commissioning process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that item as we go forward. On the other hand, the commissioning provider has the responsibility of leading the commissioning process. That's not really an overlap. Performing a review to confirm the OPR compliance. Well, in many instances, the balanceability review and the design review or other reviews that are provided or they're performed by the commissioning provider could have some overlap there. And some of that overlap may be valuable in many instances. But this is one item here where it's important to understand what both parties are doing with respect to the project scope, so that there's as little overlap as possible. Obviously, the commissioning provider has to do document procurement and system verification checklist. They develop the function and performance testing procedures, and then ultimately they'll facilitate and document the function and performance testing. you could argue that that step is redundant with the HVAC control verification step under the tab firm's responsibilities. And we're going to kind of talk about how do you distinguish those roles if, in fact, the tab firm is responsible for full control verification, and the commissioning provider is obviously going to be performing functional performance testing. So if one thing to note is if the firm is providing commissioning services only, it's very important that they review, and this goes for any commissioning provider, but especially if you have a provider that does both tab and commissioning, but on a particular project, they may be selected to only provide commissioning services. It's very important that they review the tab specifications to determine what the requirements are on the tab side for control verification. Because if it's not included at all in the tab scope, it's going to determine more so what is done in the commissioning scope. And there can be varying levels of this verification depending on the specification. And it can range from just referencing a national standard, such as the ABC national standard, to clearly spelling out what's expected of the tab provider. And so it's very, very important that this is reviewed and understood, and potentially the commissioning provider should get input on this to try and coordinate the scopes as much as possible. And hopefully that's done during the design phase or pre-bid phase, so that you know, there's no overlap on the bid process. What we advocate, and we're going to talk about here in this process, and we found to be the most valuable, is to try to include the point and sensor verification as part of the test and balance scope. But if for some reason that's not possible to put it in the tab specification, it's very, very important that that piece is picked up by the commissioning provider. And I'm gonna talk more about this as we move on, but that is one piece that could get overlooked in both scopes. If the tab spec doesn't require it, and you have a commissioning provider that may not traditionally go out and verify actual point and sensor calibration, or even require the controls contractor or the mechanical contractor to demonstrate that, it could get overlooked, and that's a very, very important step in the process. Another thing to really look at is, does the specification on the project require tab support for measurement of flows, temperatures, pressures, and any other measurements that are needed to support the commissioning process? Here in our firm, even when we're providing both services, we still include some scope on the tab side to make sure that they can be there to provide flow measurements or pressure measurements or temperature measurements or verifications and things like that in a very limited fashion to support the functional testing activities on the project. And we think that that's important irregardless of how these services are contracted. So it's just something to be mindful of as you're going through this process of really evaluating those two scopes. So I'm going to talk briefly about a hybrid strategy here. In a hybrid strategy, the assumption here is that you would have tab personnel performing what is traditionally noted as a commissioning provider role on the project. And this may stem from an owner that doesn't have a budget for a full-blown commissioning process, and they may be too late in the game to go out and hire a separate provider, or they may just want to trim the scopes down as much as they can, and so they go to the tab firm and say, all I want is what we would traditionally call on the commissioning side construction phase commissioning, which is basically functional performance testing. And so from that standpoint, if you have a qualified tab firm who has experience in control verification and has experience with commissioning processes and things like that, you can offer a hybrid approach. Is this the best approach? No, I would not argue that. But I would say that it can bring value on certain projects and for certain owners. And from that standpoint, we're going to talk about how do you do this. So in this particular case, you have commissioning personnel or folks that are skilled in commissioning within the firm create the functional testing procedures. And then you have the tab personnel actually perform those instead of the commissioning personnel. And so you would have tab personnel perform the point and sensor verification. But then in lieu of doing what we would normally consider test and balance control verification, they go through the tab personnel and perform the functional testing procedures that were written by the commissioning personnel. And then ultimately at the end of the day, and obviously this all applies to HVAC commissioning, or I'm sorry, HVAC systems primarily, and potentially some plumbing systems. This is not going to include electrical, not going to include life safety and things like that. But with respect to HVAC systems, this is a viable option depending upon the situation. And then what ultimately happens is that data gets compiled together, or the tab report can be included in the commissioning report. Again, this is a strategy that we've used with some clients when they really needed to trim the scope down significantly. We don't think it's the best strategy, but it can be done, and it can be something that's useful depending upon the budget of the project and the client's needs and so forth. So I'm going to go through the phases now of the project and try to talk about if you've got two different teams. We're going to make the assumption here that we have a tab firm that provides both services. So they have two teams on the project. One team is commissioning folks. Here in our firm, we have a commissioning team, which is dedicated commissioning professionals. That's all they do every day is commissioning work. And we have tab folks that provide tab services daily. And so we're going to make the assumption, and that's what we have here, is the same firm providing both scopes, but with two different groups. And so in each phase of the project, what is going to be the responsibility of each of these groups? And I'll talk as we go through a little bit about how this dovetails together. But we argue that the tab firm is still going to do a balanceability review. And I'll be clear about what a balanceability review is if you're not familiar with that term, or if you're not familiar with the that section of the ABC national standards. It's essentially going through and ensuring that everything's included in the project documents, in the submittals, and then ultimately what's getting installed out in the field, so that the tab can be performed. It ranges among a lot of different things, but it's making sure that you have test ports in the right locations, that you have access to certain components, so that the testing and balancing can be completed. We even go so far as to look at velocities and things on terminal units and fittings and things like that to try and gauge where we may have problems in the system. And that's all part of what we would consider a balanceability review. It's not a design review the way that you would traditionally look at it on the commissioning side. In many instances, the commissioning provider is looking at system integrations. They're looking at, does what's submitted match what's specified and installed? And in many instances, they're looking at best practices and do these different components fit together to work functionally to achieve the owner's project requirements. And so we really feel that those are two different things. The balanceability review is, do we have what we need to do the testing and balancing appropriately? And the commissioning review is more of the traditional design and submittal review process to try and ensure the quality of the commissioning process, and can we ultimately functionally test these systems and achieve the owner's project requirements. I would normally poll everyone and say, is that clear? But I can't right now, so we'll address that during the questions. But hopefully I'm getting my point across here. The other things here on the tab firm side, at this stage of the project, they really should be working on a schedule coordination, both with their commissioning counterparts, as well as, most importantly, with the project team. We see more issues arise on projects from a lack of knowledge of what is needed for the tab activities to take place and the commissioning activities for that matter. But even more so, we see that there's a lack of understanding on the construction team, and it's not their fault. They just may not know what is required for testing and balancing activities to begin, and what kind of support is going to be required thereafter, so that they can complete their activities. And so that's really what we're talking about there with schedule coordination. And what we find very valuable is the fact that when we're providing both services on a project, our commissioning team, even though they're not test and balance folks, they have a keen understanding of that, because obviously they're in the same company, and they have a deep understanding of testing and balancing, and so that they can help to provide those answers as well. And I think any other good, experienced commissioning provider can probably provide that as well. But it's very, very important that out of the two parties, being test and balance or the commissioning provider, that is communicated to the construction team, and we try to capture that in the project schedule. As we all know, project schedules don't always go as planned, but it's good to try and have those conversations up front and try to plan for the best scenario, and then obviously be dynamic and try to adapt as things move along and progress. One third requirement that the tab firm may have a responsibility for is pre-balance system requirements and or a tab plan. And I don't want to go too far into these details right now, but really what this is there may be ancillary requirements like witnessing duct pressure testing, or witnessing air handling unit component testing, and some other things that may be under the tab scope. And we routinely see that under the tab scope. They still need to take care of that if it's not redundant with the commissioning provider. That's something that needs to be coordinated up front. Another thing that we often try to do, especially on larger projects, is ask for a test and balance plan, even if it's from our own folks, because that's telling us, and more importantly, the project team, how does the tab firm plan to go about completing their work on the project, especially with respect to how the general contractor and the construction team are building the project. And this becomes very critical on larger systems such as in healthcare and research and things like that, where you have very complex systems that are not straightforward. And many times those types of systems are built vertically, or we have vertical systems, meaning we have multiple floor systems and things like that have to be tested, but the actual build outs in the facility happen horizontally. And so you can't turn things over to the tab firm the way that you would traditionally do when you have smaller systems. So that's just a good example there. On the provider side here, these are pretty standard requirements here, and I don't want to go too far into that because that's not the purpose of this presentation. But the provider at this stage of the game should be obviously presenting their commissioning plan and having a kickoff meeting if it hasn't happened already, doing their reviews and coordinating and things like that. We like to coordinate the owner training requirements early in the project, not at the end. We just find there's too many things going on at the end of the project. We want to get all this hashed out up front and make sure that the general contractor and the owner and everybody are on the same page there. And then obviously developing the system verification checklist and working through completing those with the contractor's team, and then developing the functional testing procedures. So with respect to the HVAC system startup phase, there are some unique responsibilities here, and you're going to start seeing where the tab firm is going to have a little bit more involvement at this phase. They should be walking the site at this point. They may not have in their scope to witness startup. That's commonly, at least on the projects on which we work, that's typically in the commissioning provider's scope. But they may still have some input, and they need to be doing their pre-tap site observations just to ensure that those testing locations are being installed appropriately, that they have what they need, that they have access to components and things like that, and really looking at things before they get covered by insulation or ceilings and so forth. We really like to have an early walk there before the piping and the ductwork is wrapped in insulation, and let our tab teams look and make sure that they have everything that they need and they're not going to foresee any problems. Again, schedule coordination. You're going to see that I harp on this at every stage of the game, but it's usually what kills us on every project. And then again, at this stage, you may be past duct and air handling unit pressure testing, or you could have other requirements similar to that can take place that the tab firm needs to be present for, but they're not at a stage yet where they can actually start performing the primary test and balance testing. The commissioning provider at this point should be hosting regular meetings and trying to really coordinate the schedule. If we're doing startups, the commissioning provider should be just about complete with system verification checklists. At least in our firm, we try to make sure that those are completed even before the startups are allowed to occur, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And then witnessing the startup activities. So I'm going to go through a little bit here. We're going to assume that now as we progress through the project phases, we're into the testing and balancing phase here. And so with respect to the HVAC equipment, I want to review here, in case you're not familiar, with the AABC national standards for total system balance, especially with respect to control verification, because it's going to relate back to the question of how do you divide the scope. So in the AABC national standards, it's very, very clear about what the testing and balancing firm should provide with respect to controls verification. And it's working with the BAS contractor to ensure the system is operating within the design limitations and obtain mutual understanding of the intended control system. That can happen a little bit before, but are we getting the design intent out of the control system? Secondly, verifying all hardwired safety controllers such as freestats, high-low static pressure shutdown controllers are calibrated. You can say this is a control provider or control contractor's function. In our experience, they typically install it and test the point, but they do not test the settings. And so we argue that the test and balance firm is the one that really needs to check those settings and ensure they're set up at the correct set point and they're functional. Verify all flow monitoring stations for air and water are properly calibrated and reading correctly. There is no one else typically on the project that's more qualified to measure flows than the test and balance firm. So we argue that irregardless, that is their function, is to check that. And then verify all temperature, humidity, and pressure sensors are properly calibrated and reading correctly. Again, who has the instruments already on site that should be of appropriate calibration and should have the experienced personnel on site to measure these things, and that's the test and balance firm. So verify all the control devices are properly installed. Again, test and balance firm is going to be out there in all manners of the ductwork and the piping, looking at flows, looking at pressure drops, things like that. They're the ones that really are the best to say, is the static pressure sensor for a variable air volume system in the best location? Because they know what's going on in that system. They know which terminal units or terminal devices on a hydronic system require the most demand. And so are we getting a good, accurate relation for controlling pressuring in our control loops in a variable volume system? Confirm that our control devices are in the correct position. How many times as providers in the industry of various services have we found a damper that's indicated to be open and it's actually closed? I mean, it happens all the time. And so it's very important that somebody goes through and does that. And oftentimes the tab firm has to go through and do that as part of their activities anyway. So it's very easy for them to verify that. Determine everything's connected properly, and moreover, this last statement here, confirm that all control devices are operated by the intended controller. This really means that the thermostat in room A is connected to the terminal unit that serves room A and not to the terminal unit that serves room B, which is served by another terminal unit. That's a very simple analogy there, but if you've been in the business for any length of time, you know that these things get crossed all the time. And you could argue that it's the control vendor's responsibility to do this, but we see that that's not the case. So verify the settings and operation of in switches, lockout and interlock systems. Some of these you're going to see are starting to overlap with things you would verify in a functional performance test, but this is what's in the standard. Check the operation of control valves and damper actuators, verify set points, and then ultimately confirm the sequences of operations for all control modes. So this is what the tab firm is tasked with, but we're starting to see as we move along here that we're really getting into more of what we would see on the functional performance test side. So where do we draw that line? So this is just ultimately what the national standards call for in from the balancing firm. So we're going to say in our firm, what's the best way to do this? And we argue that the testing and balancing firm should handle the terminal units and handle the sensor and point verification on the project, and then turn it over to the commissioning provider, whether that team is within their own firm or whether it's an external team, because we feel like that's the most efficient way to go about and verify everything. And so with that being said, what should the testing and balancing firm check on the terminal units? They should verify the calibration of all the airflow sensors and ensure the terminal units are set up correctly. I don't think anybody argues with that. That is the tab firm's role. And for that, they have to go through the controls to do that. They need to document in the final tab report all of the non-default operating parameters of package controllers. If you're familiar at all with BAS controls and the way that terminal unit controllers operate and things like that, there's typically canned control sequences in these controllers. And you make slight changes to achieve the intended sequence of operation from default values. And those need to be noted somewhere. And we argue that the tab firm needs to include that in their report as part of their verification of the terminal unit controls. They should also perform functionality verification and document the calibration of all the temperature sensors related to the terminal units. Backing up to the actual air handling unit system, or even the pumping system in this case, if it's a large chilled or heating water system, what should the tab firm do with respect to the overall system? Okay, they are the ones that have to test the total flow or total design flow, if there's diversity and things like that, in these large variable volume systems. So they need to determine the maximum and minimum operating pressures based upon the requirements to achieve airflow at the most remote terminal units. They're the best person to do that. And oftentimes they're called out in the specification to do that. We don't feel like that's a commissioning provider's function. The commissioning provider needs to test it during the functional performance test, but the tab firm needs to determine the set points and work with the controls vendor to do that. They also need to, as noted in the next one, determine connected capacity versus actual design capacity. Do we have less capacity on our prime moving equipment, such as an air handling unit, than we have connected to it? Oftentimes we do. You have diversity in systems that's built into the design, and that has to be verified through the tab process. And then ultimately, there are other set points that need to be put into place in oftentimes more complex control strategies that we're seeing become more mainstream now, like occupied, unoccupied, and static pressure reset scenarios and things like that. And the test and balance firm is the best one to go through and kind of figure out the maximum and minimum range. And then ultimately, the control system can operate within that range. And then as part of the functional testing, you can verify that the system is operating within that range of operations, so that we know we're not going outside of something that hasn't been tested, and we know it's going to be functional. So on the air handling unit side, what should the tab firm do, to dovetail with what we're talking about here? And it's really comes down to just verifying sensors and base functionality of components. It's not going through and doing sequencing. We're going to handle that in the functional performance testing, but it's kind of getting everything ready to make sure that the components work before functional testing occurs on the commissioning side. And so it's verify the calibration, put in offsets and record those offsets, and work with the controls vendor to do that. And then also verify correct operation of all points. So this isn't just temperature sensors and pressure sensors and flow sensors and things of that nature. It's making sure that control dampers operate correctly, making sure valves operate correctly, making sure that start-stop signals control the appropriate VFDs or other starters and devices. A whole myriad of things, but just those simple inputs and outputs we find is best for the tab firm to verify that in preparation for functional testing, which would be conducted or at least facilitated by the commissioning provider. Also, testing the safeties, as we talked about, especially high and low static pressure switches and things of that nature. I'm going to move a little quicker here because I'm running a little low on time. So when we get into the HVAC functional testing role, I'm going to change gears here, and now we're into the functional testing stage of the project. And the commissioning provider is going to be leading this to conduct the functional testing activities. So what then does the tab team do to support that process? So they're going to be there to measure flows, pressures, electrical data, and temperatures required to verify performance. Oftentimes, this is not needed if you have a robust VAS system and all this has been done in advance. But we do find instances where this needs to be verified during the functional testing. So what I argue is, irregardless of who the roles are, and especially if they're within the same firm, you don't want to overlap testing that has been done previously. So if these things have already been checked, if they've already been demonstrated previously, you don't do it again just for the purposes of demonstrating it during the functional performance test. But you do have to make sure that it was checked and shown to the appropriate parties at some point in time. Demonstrating calibration of sensors and safeties if needed. And then just being there to support anything else with their data, such as VAV system profiles, terminal unit setups, especially if you see some issues and things like that, and providing performance data so that the commissioning provider can back up and say, yes, this system is working as intended and to meet the owner's project requirements. So what are the commissioning provider roles? Verifying the sequence of operations. This is during the functional testing of HVAC equipment. Verifying the interlocks and tuning. I'm going to emphasize tuning here because that's really what you should be looking at here, and not necessarily does the valve open or close. If you initiate an input, are we getting the output? No, are we getting the right output, and is it doing it correctly over an entire system range of operation? And so tuning is something that we really focus on the commissioning side when we're providing both services here. And then alarm setup and more of the detailed inputs and outputs to the VAS control system and what things look like on the graphics, what is the operator interface, and so forth. And then really testing the operation of the system as a whole across the entire operating range, from maximum to minimum on the flow side, and then trying to replicate temperature control as well in a few different scenarios to really make sure that the loops are tuned in And as you go through the seasons, even though you may be testing in only one season, you try to see if you get a good feel of, is the system going to continue to operate, in the shoulder seasons appropriately and in the opposite seasons from when you're testing as appropriate. And then obviously the commissioning provider is going to document any issues noted during the functional testing. It's not going to be recorded as a tab issue. It'll be recorded as a commissioning issue. So that gets us through functional testing. I know I breezed through that pretty quick, but hopefully we identified the roles there pretty well. And now we're going to talk about the next phase, which is operations, warranty, closeout phase. There's a lot of terms for this, but ultimately what happens after substantial completion. And so if you have these two entities, being the tab firm and the commissioning provider, who's going to do what? Well, there could still be tab firm issues outstanding, and they're going to have to be the one that back checks that. Oftentimes, there's opposite season testing that still needs to be performed on the tab side, and then they need to provide their final reporting and supplemental reports and things like that based upon that opposite season testing. The commissioning provider has a much bigger role, though. They have issues to resolve that hopefully is a small list, but in many instances it's not. There could be polling of occupants for occupant comfort. This is required under some instances of lead and other requirements and things. They could be doing measurement and verification, and oftentimes they are the ones that are most suited to do that at this stage of the project. They could be assisting with warranty resolution and trying to get all the warranty items that are brought forward and any outstanding punch list items resolved, both with the owner and the construction team. And then ultimately, we like to provide owner training follow-up, and we like to be able to interface with the owner's O&M staff and say, now that you're operating the facility, do you feel like you were trained appropriately? Are there things that you feel like you're missing? Are there gaps? And try to facilitate filling those gaps so that ultimately, when they operate the facilities, into the future, they don't change things and so forth. So, okay. So that is really the end of my presentation, and I apologize because I did go a couple minutes longer than I would like. I want to allow plenty of time for questions here, and I think we're going to facilitate that. Sam, you're going to ask questions, and I'll try to give my best answer, right?
Right. We have about 4 questions that came in, and if anyone else still has questions, feel free to continue to submit them. The first question I have for you is, when you say tab verification for the commissioning agent, is it just a review of the tab report and not a spot check with the hood to verify CFM?
So we've seen it done a number of ways. In some instances, it could be actually going out and doing a sampling of the measurements. We see some specifications require that. We see others where the commissioning provider is just tasked with reviewing the tab report. I think it really comes down to the project team and ultimately the level of trust. And some people are probably going to disagree with me on that. But I think it ultimately comes down to the level of trust that you have in the team. And especially if you have 2 different entities there providing commissioning and testing and balancing, oftentimes there's going to be you want from a separate entity perspective, let me sample some of your measurements. Let me make sure that you really did what you said you were going to do. And I will say, within our firm, and if there are other providers out there that provide those services, oftentimes those policies and procedures, the capabilities of the people that are on your team in both regards. And so there may be more of a comfort factor, and oftentimes the owner has that comfort factor, and the construction team do as well, to say, we don't feel like that's a good value and a good use of the commissioning provider's time. So I really think that depends, and I don't have a clear answer for it. But it's definitely something you've got to look at on each project and make sure that everybody buys into the ultimate outcome there.
Okay, the next question is, why not put tab under the owner and then combine with commissioning?
Okay. I think I'm gonna answer that to the best of my ability. I think what they're asking there is, have the tab services contracted to the owner, and then ultimately have that firm provide commissioning. And I may be wrong there, but I think that's probably what we're advocating here. We advocate, and we try here in our firm, and AABC advocates this through their total system balancing standards as well, to try to perform test and balance services directly to the owner. And obviously, I think everybody would agree that commissioning services should also, in most instances, be provided directly to the owner. And so I'm not real sure if I'm answering this person's question correctly or not, but I think the short answer is yes, both of those services should go to the owner. And if it's going to be with the same firm, then definitely it makes it easier if it goes to the same owner. That person can chime in. I'll be happy to follow up with that after we get through the other questions.
Okay, the next question is, how many certified commissioning technicians do you have that are full-time commissioning people?
In our particular firm, our entire commissioning group between 3 offices is about 15 dedicated people. Versus our test and balance firm side of our house is probably north of 100 test and balance folks. I don't have any certified CXTs. We have mostly commissioning CXAs through the ACG commissioning group. I hope I answered.
Okay, another question.
Well.
Another question for you. Besides verification, in what order is it usually suggested or executed by the tab contractor? Does it start at the central plant, chillers, CT, pumps, and then to AHUs, then fan-powered boxes? They're asking if they would work down the line from the heart of the system to the lower extremities, if you will.
So we actually typically see, and I don't think you can do it the other way around, that you work from the components backwards. So in any system, especially on the air side, you're going to have to do the terminal units first, because you can't do the total air handling unit side until the terminal units work. So that would be fan-powered boxes, single duct boxes, dual duct boxes, whatever those may be. You've got to do that. If you have a constant volume system, you need to proportion the grills or the supply outlets and or return inlets first, and then you can go back and actually test the overall capacity of the system. So, and you're going to do the same thing on a hydronic side. You're going to go out and proportion your system. You're going to set up any flow control devices that are out in the system. And then you're going to back up and you're going to, do a final test on your pumps and your boilers and chillers and things like that. Once you know what your flows are out in the system, and you know what kind of restrictions you have in your system as well. So it's typically going to work from the zones that are served back to the mechanical room or to the central plant, or from the controlling zone devices back to the prime moving equipment. So I hope I answered that question as well.
And I think we have time for one more question. Someone is asking, can you come work in Virginia? Because none of our tab firms do half of what you're saying is usually in their scope.
Unfortunately, we're very busy here in Texas. Appreciate that. But that's, I think, what we're trying to get across here through these presentations and things like that is that's really what we hope the industry will try to achieve. We know that there are many people out there especially on the test and balance side, that don't do what we're advocating here. But we believe that AABC is advocating for that, and hopefully the AABC firms and their members are doing that, are allowed to do that, because I know sometimes those scopes are limited. But we truly believe that this brings the best process for the owner in the end. And And we've got a lot of experience with that here on our projects, and with some very satisfied owners and very prestigious owners down here in Texas.
Yeah, the same person actually just mentioned that she's never seen all those requirements in tab spec in this part of the country. Mid-Atlantic is where she's from.
Okay.
And that was the last question. I just want to close things out by thanking Justin and everyone who joined us, including our members across all 3 organizations. Please keep an eye out for an email informing you regarding your learning units from the CX Energy app. And while you're in the CX Energy app, we ask all participants to evaluate this technical presentation. We hope to see you next week for Succeed When You Leave, Strategies for Ensuring Persistence of Savings on Energy Projects, taking place May 7th at 2 p.m. Have a great week, everyone.